Okay, so let's get going. Good morning, everybody. My name is Zoe Abrahamson. I'm the Senior Funding Advisor at Bond. So some of you will already know me through some of the work that we do with the Funding Working Group and other kind of funding related groups. We're really excited here today to have the third session of the Funding for Development Week, which is a series of online events taking place every single morning this week on all different areas of funding. And day 3, we're really pleased to have Seek Development come to talk to us about Donor Tracker and looking at funding for gender equality and how donors are spending it. It's an hour-long session with an opportunity, with presentations at the start, and then an opportunity to ask questions after the presentation. First of all, we have from Seek Development, Kalia Yeager, who's an associate consultant at Seek Development, where she's a member of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Donor Tracker project team. Kalia leads on all their work in gender equality, focusing on SRHR access and initiatives to prevent gender-based violence, FGM, and women's financial inclusion and economic empowerment. She's joined by her colleague Zoe Johnson, who's a policy and editorial assistant, who also works on the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation's Donor Tracker projects. Zoe leads all the planning, coordination for the donor profile updates and conducts data-driven analyses of development policy and financing. As they're leading on most of the session, I'm going to hand over to them. But just to say before we do that, you'll see that there's a Q&A box just at the bottom of your screen. So the chat box has been disabled, but the Q&A bit is where you can pop in questions. So throughout the presentation, drop in questions if you have them, and then we'll get to them at the end after the presentations. And then also just to let you know that we are recording this session, and we will share the PowerPoint and the session afterwards. Handing over to you, both of you now.
Thank you very much, Zoe, for the kind introduction, and to Bond for having us here today. We are very excited to have this opportunity to speak at your Funding for Development Week and to share these findings from our Gender Equality Insights series. Before we dive into the data, I'd just like to take a couple of minutes to introduce the Donor Tracker, and then I will give you an overview of how we use OECD data to track funding for gender equality, as well as an explanation of the specific methodologies that we used for each of these 3 insights pieces. Then I'll hand over to my colleague Kalila, who will present our findings from the first 2 of these insights pieces and our preliminary results from the 3rd analysis. So in a nutshell, the Donor Tracker is a flagship initiative of Seek Development, which is a strategic and organizational consultancy focused on global development impact and based in Berlin. The Donor Tracker is a global public good, so it's designed to support development advocates in their work by providing evidence-based analyses of OECD Development Assistance Committee, or as we'll call it in this presentation, DAC, Donors, Development Policy and Financing. Specifically, we focus on 14 major donors and their ODA, or Official Development Assistance. And for each of the 14 donors, we produce and then update every year what we call a donor profile. And these profiles cover donors' strategic priorities, funding trends, decision-making structures, budget processes, as well as highlighting key opportunities at which advocates should think about engaging with each donor. The donor profiles include analyses across 7 sectors. Gender equality was added as a new sector this year, along with climate finance. And in addition to our profiles and sector pages, we also produce what we call insights reports, as well as partner perspectives. And these reports highlight key issues and trends in the development finance world. And the findings that we're presenting today come from an insights series that we're running this year, which provides detailed analyses of 3 main elements, or what we're calling pillars of gender equality endeavors. We also publish weekly policy updates, which cover news from all of the donor markets that we cover. So, as you know, we're here today to speak about donor countries' funding towards women's empowerment. So let me begin by just laying out the scope of what exactly it is that we're talking about today. Of course, there are an infinite number of interesting questions we would love to answer, but at the Donor Tracker, our bread and butter is really data-driven analyses. So we're ultimately limited by the data that's available. And because we're also interested in funding across donors and analyzing or analyzing funding across donors, as well as doing kind of cross-donor comparisons, we're ultimately limited to data sources that can provide comparable cross-donor funding figures. Of course, the OECD is the foremost reliable and comparable source of financing data. So that's what we draw most heavily on in our work at the Donor Tracker. But as a result, we're also somewhat limited by the information that donors can communicate through their funding figures reported to the OECD. So namely, these are purpose codes and policy markers. For anyone who doesn't already know, purpose codes are sector classifications. So they're used by donors to indicate the area of a recipient's economic or social structure that transfer is intended to foster. Whereas policy markers are used to describe ODA in relation to OECD development policy objectives, such as gender equality. Obviously, these don't cover every single dimension of donor funding. So for example, there would be no way for us to analyze how much funding is going to organizations headed by people of color, which I know has been a topic of interest for Bond. But the OECD does continue to develop its reporting mechanisms by regularly introducing new purpose codes and policy markers to better track development funding flows. And hopefully, as they continue to add these, we can begin to do even more kind of interesting and in-depth analyses. One example is the addition of the gender-based violence purpose code, which was added in 2017, and we'll discuss it shortly. So as many of you likely already know, development spending in support of gender equality is tracked through donors self-reporting using the OECD's gender equality policy marker. And this marker is used to identify projects that have a positive impact on advancing gender equality or reducing gender discrimination. The marker is based on a 3-point scale. So first, we have funding for projects in which gender equality is an important and deliberate component, but not the main goal. And this kind of funding is marked with a 1 to indicate that gender equality is a significant objective. So for example, if a donor were to fund basic education or a project for basic education that was aimed at benefiting both boys and girls, the project could still be marked as having a significant gender objective if it also had the explicit goal of addressing gender-specific barriers to girls' education. So say, for example, part of the project involved providing financial incentives to encourage families to send their girls to school, then that could be marked with a 1. It is really important to note, though, that funding is tagged at a project level. So it's not only the gender components of the funding that are reflected in the overall funding figures, but rather total funding flows to the marked project. Funding for projects in which gender equality is the main goal are marked with a 2 to indicate that gender equality is the principal objective of the project. So at the Donor Tracker, we think this principal funding is a clearer picture of donors' true commitment to gender equality. An example of a principal tag project could be something, again, using the example of education, a project that specifically targets girls' access to education or performance in school. And the main objective of such a project would be reducing gender-based inequalities in education. Projects can also be tagged as not having a gender-related objective, of course. So that there's your 3-point scale, 0, 1, and 2. But it's also possible that funding is not screened against the policy marker. So for each of these markers, the OECD sets a minimum recommended criteria that projects should meet. But it's worth noting that donors themselves are, at the end of the day, responsible for self-reporting. And a recent analysis by Oxfam revealed that around a quarter of all of these projects self-reported by donors were mismarked, which has implications for the validity of funding figures. Speaking of funding figures, here we have an overview of funding from DAC donors towards projects that name gender equality as a principal or significant goal. So you can see from the chart on your screen that total funding for gender equality increased in 2018, which is the most recent year for which OECD data is available. And it reached a total of $44.1 billion US. This represents a 9% increase in real terms from the year before. And the increase can largely be attributed to a few major donors. So Germany, the EU institutions, the United Kingdom, Canada, the Netherlands, and Switzerland all increased their gender equality funding by over $400 million between 2017 and 2018. And Germany alone, which is the largest donor to gender equality, also increased its gender-related funding by $790 million compared to 2017. So that reached a total of 7.1 billion in gender funding in 2018. In 2018, you can see 39% of bilateral ODA dispersed by DAC members targeted gender equality, including both significant and principal funding again. This is an increase over 2017 and an even more significant increase over 2012. So essentially that means that even though in 2018, most development funding was still gender blind, there has been a slow increase in donors' prioritization of gender equality. As you can see from the darker pink portion of the bar, principal funding has remained stagnant. So this indicates that all of these increases that I've just been talking about have been channeled towards significant marked projects as opposed to those which name gender equality as the principal goal. And finally, it's worth noting that in 2018, donors' screening of funding against the policy marker declined compared to previous years. So in total, 93% of funding that was eligible for screening was screened in 2018, down from 97% in 2017. So that gives you an idea of what OECD data looks like and overall trends in recent years. But now we'd like to dig down a little bit deeper. So for our Gender Equality Insights series, we conducted more in-depth analyses of funding to a few specific elements of gender equality. And to share our findings, we're producing a bundle of 3 publications. So the first tackles women's economic empowerment and financial inclusion. The second looks at efforts to end gender-based violence. And the third, which we're currently working on, looks at sexual and reproductive health and rights, in particular funding for family planning. And we chose this focus specifically on family planning because it's a component of sexual and reproductive health and rights that has particularly profound implications for women and girls. So we relied on OECD data for all 3 of these analyses, but employed slightly different methodologies for each. So the first, on women's economic empowerment, analyzed 21 purpose codes deemed the economic and productive sectors, and looked at how much of the funding flowing to these sectors was gender related, which sectors received the most gender related funding, and which donors are spending the most in these sectors. The analysis was limited to funding eligible for screening against the gender equality policy marker. So we looked specifically at bilateral flows from the 30 DAC donors. And for reference, we developed this methodology based on a 2019 report from the G7. Our second analysis, we used the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls Purpose Code. So we, again, only looked at bilateral ODA provided by donors. That means that core contributions from multilateral organizations were not included in our analysis. We realized that this purpose code doesn't sufficiently capture the multifaceted approach that's necessary to eradicate violence against women and girls. So we also analyzed 6 additional purpose codes that have the potential to deconstruct the civic, judicial, and governmental conditions that enable GBV. Finally, we are currently working on an analysis of funding to family planning, as I mentioned. The findings that we present to you here show funding flows for projects tagged with the family planning purpose code. This includes both bilateral and multilateral flows. And I would also just like to stress that these are rough first findings. So the figures we present will differ slightly from those you might find in other reports on funding for family planning that use a more specific methodology, such as the wonderful reports published by the Kaiser Family Foundation. They do an annual report on funding for family planning. And these are also heavily cited in the annual reports for Family Planning 2020. So both are great resources for any of you that have a particular interest in this third topic. And with that, I will hand things over to Kalila, who will share some of our findings.
Thanks for that great introduction, Zoe. Let's dive right in with the first of our 3 pillars of gender equality, that's women's economic empowerment. So economic empowerment refers to women's right to earn, spend, and save their own money. Women's economic rights go hand in hand with personal agency and political power. Chronic underpaying of women across industries in nearly every country in the world means women earn less than their male counterparts, even in the richest nations. Women perform at least 2.5 times more unpaid domestic labor than men, including tasks like cooking, cleaning, and providing child and elder care. These hours of unpaid work hinder their ability to attend school, study, or take on paid work outside of the home. So when we take this unpaid labor into account, we know that women around the world work many more hours per day than men, and they earn significantly less. We also know that when women are economically empowered, their empowerment causes ripples of positive change across their communities. Women who have control over their income and expenditures tend to invest in the education of their children. When they start businesses, they tend to hire other women. And this means that women's economic empowerment and financial inclusion, as I said, sort of ripples across communities and generations, lifting other community members out of poverty and boosting the educational level of generations to come. So you can see here that funding for women's economic empowerment has increased steadily since 2014, which is a very positive sign. We do, of course, see a positive trend both in terms of total billions being allocated to the economic and productive sectors, as well as the percentage of funding to those sectors that is gender related. I do want to point out, though, that even in 2018, with all the increases we've seen, less than a third of all economic empowerment funding includes gender equality, even as one of many objectives. So that's that significant funding we spoke about. With the 2030 deadline for the Sustainable Development Goals approaching, this really is woefully insufficient. I also want to note that the principal spending, that's the spending on economic empowerment projects where gender equality is the central focus, continues to make up a very, very small proportion of total spending. And unfortunately, we don't see that proportion increasing in any meaningful way. You can see that there with the dark pink at the bottom of the chart, and it's really stagnating across the line. So these increases that we're seeing are powered only by increases in significant spending. These projects are important and they're a step in the right direction, but they do not tend to achieve the same kind of results as projects whose sole purpose is to end financial inequality. And just to note, the top 3 economic and productive sectors that receive the most gender-related funding are agriculture, transport and storage, and banking and financial services. Okay, so as we see here, France really dwarfs all other DAC donors, with 265 million channeled to programs in the economic and productive sectors with gender as a principal objective in 2018. This is over 2.5 times the funding of its closest runner-up, the US. So just a note, this graph only shows that principal spending that we mentioned. Following in the footsteps of Sweden and Canada, France announced its new policy of feminist diplomacy in 2019, committing to channeling 50% of its ODA to projects with gender equality as a significant or principal goal. And those 2 runners up there, the US and Sweden, are both traditional gender champions as well. Excuse me. So over on the right, if we're looking at recipients, we see that Colombia is sort of outpacing the others. Colombia has made important strides in gender equality over the past 2 decades. It rose to a ranking of 22nd out of 153 countries from the World Economic Forum's 2020 Global Gender Gap Index, which was a pretty remarkable rise as it had 40th place in 2018. So to move from 40th to 22nd was pretty remarkable. Colombia has been the focus of major efforts towards gender equality since the beginning of peace negotiations in 2012. Okay. So post-pandemic economic reconstruction, which centers women, will be universally beneficial. The full inclusion of women in labor markets worldwide would add an estimated 28 trillion to the global economy. Because of women's precarious position in the global economy, COVID has been especially devastating for them. In South Asia, over 80% of women in non-agricultural jobs are informally employed with no benefits. In sub-Saharan Africa, the same figure is 74%. So these women rarely have access to health coverage or sick days or any of the typical benefits that many of us have really heavily relied on during this pandemic, right? Informal and especially physical labor is not easily made remote. So women who do rely on their own earnings to support themselves or their families must in many cases continue to expose themselves to unsafe physical conditions. The types of knowledge-based, technology-based jobs that easily go remote are overwhelmingly dominated by men. And in general, they're much less available in low-income nations. Now, given the colossal economic shocks caused by the COVID-19 crisis, measures that hinder women's participation in the labor workforce are truly a direct threat to our global economic recovery. So what should we be focusing on as we look ahead? Development advocates should continue to pressure donors to follow up on commitments to gender equality with quantifiable action and to allocate more principal funding to the economic empowerment initiatives. NGOs and advocates should push for policy that both makes women's unpaid labor obsolete and builds infrastructure and resources to support entrance into the paid labor force. So this has been a bit of a whirlwind tour of the economic empowerment scene, and with that, we're going to transition quickly into the next topic. There's so much to say, but we're going to move now to talk about gender-based violence. So first of all, what is gender-based violence? As I'm sure many of you know, any threat or violence against a person because of their sex or gender identity is gender-based violence, or GBV. GBV can be physical, psychological, emotional, or sexual, and may take the form of deprivation of resources or access to services. I want to note here, men and boys and people of all genders can be victims of GBV, but the vast majority of the world's GBV is perpetrated by men and boys against girls and women. So that's the group that we'll be focusing on here. And unfortunately, the prevalence of gender-based violence really is astounding. 70% of women have experienced physical or sexual violence from an intimate partner in their lifetime. Girls and women represent 72% of all human trafficking victims, and the vast majority of those trafficking victims are trafficked for forced sexual labor. And at least 200 million girls and women have undergone forced genital cutting. Most cases are performed on girls under 5 years old. These are just some of the really devastating statistics that you'll start to see if you look into the issue. We're really just grazing the surface here. The scale of the problem is truly staggering. And with most statistics in the gender equality sphere, these problems are all underreported. So GBV is not only a human rights problem, it's also a really expensive economic problem. GBV is estimated to cost some states up to 3.7% of their GDP. That's more than twice the average expenditure on education. So eliminating gender-based violence by tackling some of the root causes could save states a lot of money on the back end, providing shelter services and police proceedings, etc. So before we move on, it's really important to note, although we're talking about gender-based violence here in a development context, this is a problem in every single country in the world, in every single town. Wealthy nations are not immune to this problem, far from it. And the systems which enable abusers are baked into the institutions of every society. We're going to touch on that more in a few minutes. For now, let's take a look at the funding landscape. So this spike in funding that you see there in 2018 was due mostly to a major contribution by the European Union to the Spotlight Initiative. And that's a brand new multilateral initiative co-led by UN institutions such as UN Women and UNFPA in partnership with the European Union. Spotlight is the first major international initiative seeking to address the epic proportions of gender-based violence globally, with targeted regional programs focused specifically on addressing regional manifestations of gender-based violence. Spotlight was launched with 500 million euros of seed funding from the EU in 2017, part of which was dispersed in 2018. So that accounts for that funding increase you see there. So again, that major funding package to Spotlight is illustrated here, with the EU accounting for over 40% of the total spending on ending gender-based violence in 2018. Taking second place, but of course trailing well behind the EU, is the UK, which has also taken a strong stance on ending GBV. And Sweden in third place is, of course, a gender champion in general, as one of those three nations I mentioned with the feminist foreign policy. So gender equality targets are mainstreamed into every element of their development portfolio, and you'll see that they consistently show up in those top rankings for donors. Now, over on the right, we see that Afghanistan received the most support in this area, and funding to Lebanon and Uganda followed up. Okay. Funding is urgently needed to combat the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on gender-based violence. So while we have seen some excellent progress on this issue, namely with the foundation of the Spotlight Initiative in 2017, the problem of gender-based violence is rapidly worsening under the conditions of the pandemic. Lockdowns force women and children to stay home with violent abusers, shelters, and other support services have had to close, cutting off access to resources. Just one really frightening illustration of that, in Spain, the call volume to domestic violence hotlines has spiked by 493% since the start of the COVID-19 lockdowns. And again, like all of these statistics, we know the prevalence is likely drastically underreported. So what can advocates do to start to address this problem? As our data shows, donors need to increase spending on activities that directly target GBV and consistently make use of the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls Purpose Code. That kind of targeted spending will be super important, and so will efforts to accurately track spending, which will allow advocates to monitor the flows of funding and help states shape better policies to respond. Lastly, advocates should push donors to increasingly mainstream gender in projects in areas such as human rights, legal and judicial development, and legislators and political parties. Projects in these areas which target gender equality as a significant or especially as a principal objective can help to reshape the institutional forces that enable and perpetuate gender-based violence, such as police responses and judicial action. We also know that women holding office and helping to shape the laws that police and judiciaries will enforce makes a really big difference in whether survivors of gender-based violence will come forward and whether they're able to get justice and reach safety. Unfortunately, legislatures, judiciaries, and law enforcement are still really overwhelmingly dominated by men, and that's everywhere in the world. That's why projects that target these areas with gender equality objectives can have a really significant positive impact on the efficacy of direct anti-GBV work. NGOs that support women's political participation and fight for their legal rights as full citizens are really crucial to this effort. And for now, again, so much more to say, but we're going to transition into our last topic for today's session on funding for sexual and reproductive health, specifically family planning. So sexual and reproductive health, or SRH, is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being in all matters relating to the reproductive system. Family planning plays a crucial role in sexual and reproductive health, as you all know. Unless women are able to choose if and when to become pregnant, they are not able to fully exercise control over their lives, pursuing education or a career or any other goals they may have as, human beings. As you will all know, access to contraception is especially challenging in low and middle income countries. For example, 49% of pregnancies in lower middle income countries are unintended. That's 111 million unintended pregnancies annually. And they result in 30 million unplanned births, 69 million abortions, of which 35 million are unsafe, and 12 million miscarriages, which can be very dangerous in places where people don't have immediate access to the healthcare that they need. I also want to note that adolescent girls have a much higher unmet need for contraception than all women total. So 43% of adolescent girls have an unmet need for contraception compared to 24% of all women. And just a quick note, unmet need is defined by the number of women who are sexually active and who do not want to become pregnant, but who do not have access to birth control. So as we see here, the US was by far the largest donor of bilateral funds to family planning services in 2018. US funding for family planning has been more or less stagnant since 2011 at around 600 million, despite attempts by President Trump to reduce funding to this important sector. Throughout his presidency, the Trump administration proposed cuts to family planning funding, but Congress did not approve these cuts, opting instead to maintain funding at the same or even increasing levels for prior years. Trump nevertheless impacted family planning funding by expanding the infamous Mexico City policy, or global gag rule, eliminating US development funding for any health service provider which provides or quote unquote promotes abortion. These policies resulted in a really devastating loss of funds. So an estimated 9 billion in funding was cut, and this had really far-reaching effects on projects of all types, not just abortion services. So huge losses to the whole global health space, including notably HIV work, although HIV funding is not pictured in this graph, but it was really badly affected by that policy. Even accounting for these funding cuts, though, the US remains a top-line donor to family planning services, and the incoming Biden administration has committed to overturning the Mexico City policy on day one of the presidency. So we can see that the majority of top recipients of family planning spending are located on the African continent, with Ethiopia, Mozambique, and Malawi as the top 3 partner nations. And the US and the UK were the top 2 donors to all 3 of those top 3 recipient nations. Ethiopia, the top recipient of ODA for family planning, has one of the highest fertility rates in Africa, with 45% of its population under the age of 15. So that's a lot of young people. But the government has been committed to providing equitable access to safe, effective, and affordable contraception, particularly for youth, since at least 2012. So they are making some strides there. Yeah. Okay. And as Zoe mentioned at the beginning, we've used a slightly different methodology here to account for the important role that multilaterals play in this sector. So here you see a ranking of donors, which includes both multilateral and bilateral spending. So multilateral spending refers to funding, as you probably know, that's channeled through multilateral organizations like UNFPA in this case. And bilateral spending refers to spending that goes directly to individual countries. So both are pictured here. Again, we see that the US takes first place. It didn't provide any funding to UNFPA, so its ranking remains unchanged, as does its absolute total. The UK maintains its second place, but a larger total is present when you account for the multilateral spending. And then Sweden, Norway, and the Netherlands have actually knocked Canada down the list. Canada was third place in the last graph, but here, due to their large contributions to UNFPA, they've displaced it. In Sweden's case, multilateral contributions accounts for its full family planning package. So as you can see, funding for family planning has fluctuated over the last 5 years. According to the Kaiser Family Foundation, the dip in funding in 2016 was primarily due to an increase in the value of the US dollar against all other currencies, as well as disbursement by the US, disbursement delays, sorry. So that dip in funding there is a bit visually misleading. Between 2016 and 2018, there have actually been solid increases in family planning funding, according to the policy marker. And a lot of donors actually significantly increased their spending between 2017 and 2018, including Canada, Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, the US, and the UK. They all increased their funding for 2018, so you see that bump there. The US alone actually accounted for approximately 2/3 of the overall increase in funding between 2017 and 2018. But again, this increase was largely due to the timing of disbursement, so it doesn't actually reflect an actual increase in US appropriations by Congress. US funding has been steady for years, again, despite the Trump administration's efforts to make cuts there. So we've also shown the proportion of overall health funding represented by family planning, that's depicted in yellow. So you can see sort of what percentage family planning accounts for when you look at total health expenditure. As you can see, that's also increased, though it's worth noting that overall funding to health was lower in 2018 to 2017. So this bar here just shows you family planning volumes, and the total health volume was a bit lower. Yeah, total funding to health was approximately the same in 2016 and 2018. Even so, we actually have seen a slight increase in donors' prioritization of family planning and their overall health funding in the last 3 years. So again, as we mentioned, these are preliminary findings to give you a rough idea of the kind of funding volumes that we're looking at in this sector. We recommend for those of you who are interested, as Zoe mentioned, to check out the Kaiser Family Foundation. They have great annual reports on family planning funding. And our final insights piece is scheduled to be released in the new year. So do stay tuned and we'll have many more specific findings to present at that time. Okay, as the data from 2018 show, access to family planning was already a huge challenge 2 years ago across the globe. And as with the other two topics I've presented on today, the pandemic has been a gut punch to progress on family planning as well, unfortunately. So for every 3 months the lockdown continues, up to 2 million additional women may be unable to access modern contraceptives. Overcrowding in healthcare centers combined with a dramatic uptick in domestic violence, as we talked about, is resulting in a crisis of real crisis of reproductive autonomy. Unfortunately, in the past, governments have not always done a great job balancing epidemic responses with the maintenance of ongoing reproductive health programming. Notably, when Sierra Leone closed schools during the Ebola crisis, adolescent pregnancy rates really went through the roof. In many Ebola-affected countries, the national responses did not prioritize sexual and reproductive health at all, and the programs didn't sufficiently adapt to the outbreak, leading in major disruption of services. In Liberia, during the Ebola outbreak, more women died of obstetric complications than from Ebola. So you can see these sort of all or nothing pandemic responses can really have devastating effects. Diminished public trust in the health system and fear of contracting a pandemic virus increases poor health outcomes for women and girls who refuse to seek life-saving sexual and reproductive health services because they're scared to get sick from a virus. And the limited mobility due to lockdowns, like we've talked about and all experienced, have increased gender-based violence at home, contributing to unwanted pregnancies and unsafe abortions. If the lockdown continues for 6 more months with major service disruptions, 7 million unintended pregnancies are expected to occur. Advocates need to press governments to make sure that funding for strengthened responses to COVID-19 don't come at the expense of crucial women's health care. Women's health cannot be put on hold, and that has to be kind of the overarching message that we're all sending. So, wrapping up, how should we as advocates for sustainable development and for gender equality be feeling about the overall landscape of funding? Well, progress since the 1995 Beijing Platform for Action is very encouraging, but massive challenges remain. We have to remember that SDG 5, that's achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls, really was one of the most ambitious. We've seen increases in gender-targeted ODA overall and in spending for projects targeting all 3 of the pillars that we've talked about today, and that is a really positive sign. But funding is truly a drop in the bucket of what's necessary. we need donors to consistently use the gender equality policy marker when tracking their ODA in order to supply advocates with accurate data on the state of gender equality funding. To end on a positive note, it's worth remembering that though the task of recovering economically and societally from COVID-19 will be truly gargantuan, it also represents an opportunity to mainstream gender across every type of economic project and across overhauls to community services and medical systems. And I just kind of want to leave you with this food for thought. There is no reason why the system that we build after this pandemic has to look the same as it did before. So let's get ambitious. We have the potential to build a better, fairer, more just system that raises up girls and women and elevates all of our rights as citizens and as human beings. So I say, let's dream big, let's get to work. We got our work cut out for us. So that's it from our side. We're eager to hear your questions and to engage with you. If you have larger questions or want to reach out to us, our information is here, and do keep an eye out for our coming publications. Thanks so much for your attention, and back over to you, Zoe.
Thanks so much, both of you. That was really interesting and great to hear about kind of how different donors are attacking, or so to speak, gender equality and the different ways that it's broken down between countries. It's really, really insightful. I just wanted to start with a question that Eleanor dropped in at the start of the session. So this may be for Zoe, I'm not sure, but she's asked, how does donor tracker align or relate to the IATI initiative? Because a lot of bond members will be working with IATI in a lot of their programs.
Sure, yeah. We do sometimes take a look at IATI data, but we tend to depend more closely on OECD figures and using the OECD CRS database mainly for our analyses as opposed to IATI, but obviously have some of the kind of same goals around trying to make this information accessible as IATI does. So I think they do really wonderful work. Yeah, it's just a different, the way our systems have been set up. I think we also, IATI has grown quite significantly in recent years. And when we started, I think had kind of less data and less easily usable data than it does now. Yeah, that's the long and the short of it, I guess.
Thank you. There's a question from Emma that's just come through asking if you know if there are any smaller donors or foundations out there that are supporting gender equality.
Sure, I can jump in on this. Absolutely. Yes, we've just pictured here sort of top 15 to make the slides readable and digestible. The donor tracker is a really great resource for that because we show those donor rankings, more than 15 of them. You can look at the donor profiles that we have. But yes, you can, if you know how to use the OECD CRS database, which is a bit complicated, you can view all of them, but there's also a number of really great data tools out there that make it a bit more digestible so you don't have to comb through a whole database. Equal Measures 2030 has some great information, as does ONE. They have a gender data dashboard, and Donor Tracker will be also releasing a data tool this year, so keep an eye out on that. And yes, private foundations also make up a good proportion of funding to gender equality. Of course, notably the Gates Foundation, Kaiser Family Foundation, but yeah, there's also private and public funding going to both of these.
Great, thank you. And also just to say, if you're a bond member and you're part of the bond funding working group, we've been doing lots of work on feminist funding over the last year or so. And we do have those webinars with AWID and the Frida Fund online as well. So you can have a listen there as well. There's a couple of questions that have just come in. Maria is asking if you think there'll be any future analysis of trans lives in the context of gender funding. So looking more at funding going to trans people and organizations.
Zoe, do you want to take it or shall I?
Yeah, you go for it.
Okay, sure. So we don't have anything in the pipeline right now that's focused specifically on trans lives, but that is a super important topic. And I think especially in the gender equality world, as I mentioned, we often have to, or tend to focus on sort of violence against women and girls because that is the majority of survivors of gender-based violence. I'm talking specifically about the gender-based violence world right now. Off the top of my head, I don't have the name of organizations that are doing that important work, but I can get back to you on that if you're looking for groups that are tracking that. And it's something that we're definitely thinking a lot about at Donor Tracker, that we're aware of, trying to integrate more of that lens into the work we do, because I think it too often does get left out because, you know, you have to crunch your data into these sort of very digestible pieces, and it's hard to get every nuance in there, but it's super important, and I'm glad you raised it. So maybe we can reach out to you if we have further resources.
Yeah, I think again, the issue is with the data that's available and the reality of tracking of donor funding at the moment is that it's focused specifically on women and girls. And unfortunately, that obviously leaves a lot of victims of gender-based violence out. And, you know, all the more reason that we should be pushing for more and better data, as we like to say at the Donor Tracker. And yeah, continuing to kind of work towards having even more funding flows tracked even more specifically so that we can really hold donors accountable for all of these important issues.
Thank you. There's another question that's just come in from Sarah, and I think I answered a similar question before, but maybe have not put in the correct link. But people are asking for the links to the 2 publications that you referred to. So I think I just shared a link to your main gender equality page, but if you're able to find links to the publications, we can share those afterwards because people are keen to hear or dig in a little bit more into the detail.
Yeah, we can absolutely, oh, sorry, didn't mean to cut you off. We can absolutely share them. And I just wanted to also mention, we ran sort of a full-length hour-long webinar on both of the 2 that are already published. Those recordings are also available on donortracker.org. So the publications are there. And then if you're interested in seeing sort of a more in-depth presentation in this format on each of the publications themselves, that's also available.
Brilliant, thank you. There's another question that's come through from Joe saying, great presentation. We know that to achieve gender equality, we need men and boys to engage and be part of the solution, especially if we're to shift social and cultural norms. To what extent is the Donor Tracker able to consider this within tracking projects and prioritize gender equality, and particularly in light of what the principal objective takes into account?
That's a great question. Thanks for that one. Yes, so men and boys are really the magic ingredient to achieving gender equality. And I'm so glad you raised that. So in terms of the funding tracking, it's a bit challenging. That's kind of why we mentioned in the Ending Violence Against Women and Girls that we added these other purpose codes to the analysis to sort of take into account the other kinds of sort of indirect work that's necessary to change cultural norms. So we talked mostly today about sort of the political ones, but there's all kinds of other purpose codes that account for example, women's movements and feminist organizations. They tend to do a lot of that kind of grassroots work with men and boys. Or social protection is another one where they work specifically with sort of marginalized groups and helping marginalized groups advocate for themselves to the mainstream public. If you're interested in this topic, in our last webinar a couple of weeks ago, we had 2 really amazing panelists on from Oxfam Canada and from Promundo. And Promundo works specifically with men and boys. They run or rather they design best practices programming for how to reach men and boys. So I won't get too much into the details, but it was super fascinating. I learned a ton from the speaker on the topic about how they reach boys at sort of a young age, and then also again at fatherhood. And I highly recommend the webinar to learn about this because I think it's super fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I can just tack on to that again on this kind of data issue. as I mentioned at the beginning, donors report using the policy marker. It's self-reported using the policy marker. So what donors deem to be gender related principally or significantly, I mean, of course, the OECD provides some guidance, but there is some discrepancy. So whether a donor would deem a project that is targeting men and boys, but still has gender equality objectives, and whether they would tag that is in the end up to the donor to decide. And that's why, work looking at kind of what are the actual projects by our colleagues at UNF, as Kalila mentioned, doing kind of keyword analyses of trying to look at like, okay, well, so all of these donors are spending all of this money on significantly projects tagged with this significant marker, but what does that actually look like, and what do these projects actually involve? And in some cases, those could be projects involving men and boys. And I mean, there's also some discrepancy between donors, of course, because it's up to each individual donor around how strict they are with the policy markers, and that can also impact how much funding they're reporting based on those. So I think that's something else to just consider when talking about the men and boys angle.
Thanks. And there's a question from Marissa that I think you probably already answered, where she's asking about if there's any focus on capturing intersectionality within the data. So women with disabilities, women from ethnic minorities. So I'm assuming that this is all built into that response. It's about the data and what can we do to try and encourage donors to get tagging, so to speak. Okay. We've got loads of questions here that are coming through. There's one here from Iria, who's saying there's been an increase in funding for gender equality as a significant objective, but not an increase in funding for programs, projects with gender equality in the main objectives. Would you say that this is likely to change?
I'll jump in quickly, and then Zoe, maybe if you want to add. Well, we're not in the business of forecasting, and it's difficult to say, but I will say that in the last couple of years, with these 3 top-line donors, France, Sweden, and Canada, taking on feminist foreign policy, that has been sort of a seismic shift in terms of gender's integration in the development world. In a lot of cases, that funding is significant, as we mentioned, so significant funding rather than principal, I mean. But seeing these donors who are sort of big fish saying, hey, gender needs to be a part of every single policy, that has really shifted the conversation. And I think it's made room for smaller donors or other donors, and those donors as well, to start really focusing in on those principal projects. So that's definitely what we're advocating for at the Donor Tracker. We're really, we try to supply advocates with the data that they need, so we're not directly advocates, but as Zoe mentioned, we see principal funding as sort of, quote unquote, real commitment. So we'd definitely like to see that change, and we can use all your help as advocates to push for that too. Yeah,
as Kalila said, we really find, I mean, we can't make forward-looking predictions beyond kind of looking at donors' policies. And I think, though, that it is a really interesting moment to be thinking about what gender funding will look like because of, I mean, everything going on in the world, the fact of COVID, as Kalila highlighted really nicely throughout that whole presentation. Also government changes, obviously the incoming presidency in the US and in the UK, the merger going on with DFID and the FCO, Foreign Commonwealth Office. Yeah, so I think it's going to be really, it's like an interesting time to see some of these donors which are committed to gender equality, what that actually is going to look like in coming years. But and again, I keep coming back to it, but we are really limited by the data that we have through the OECD. And one thing that I didn't mention in the answer to the initial question about IADI is that the OECD, one of the kind of limiting things about it is that it data is delayed because there's this whole reporting mechanism through which donors report, and then the data is compiled by the OECD and released as kind of a comparable systematic data set. But that means we don't have data from 2019 yet, even though now we're at the end of 2020. So there is this kind of lag, which makes it also difficult to really analyze what's happening now and what's happening in these moments of great change. Yeah, so and the thing about IADI data is that it is a little bit more future oriented, but this kind of future oriented data is like not as systematically verified as through the OECD. So we really work, our analyses are based on gross disbursements, so money that has actually been spent by donors, already given to whatever sector or cause or organization, and not even analyzing commitments that donors have made. But yeah, reiterating what Kalila said, I mean, I think there are really promising policy commitments being made, and we can only hope that those will be reflected in the funding figures for the next years.
Thank you both. There's a question here which from Eleanor that's asking, do you also look at the quality of the funding? So how effective the programs are at actually addressing gender inequality and the effectiveness of their approaches?
No, we don't. The short answer is no. Yeah, I mean, the donor tracker is really committed to providing high-level funding figures, making information available, making OECD data digestible and accessible for advocates so that they can use it to inform their advocacy work or development professionals in their work. We don't generally look at project level data or countries' monitoring and evaluation per se. I mean, we do, if you take a look at our donor profiles, you'll see we do report on how donors are monitoring and evaluating their projects, but we don't do that kind of project level analyses. Yeah.
If I can just jump in on that as well, one thing to add. We have seen some really interesting reports on that topic, though. There was a report from Oxfam, I think it was last year, correct me if I'm wrong, Zoe, that was basically on the topic of how much of the gender marked funding is actually realized in gender project focus. And this report was kind of an eye opener for me and for many of us at Donor Tracker, because it found that as much as 25% of projects that are marked with gender as a significant objective have actually no gender focus at all. So that's why we constantly are stressing when we're showing you those charts that show principal and significant sort of disaggregated, why we're constantly stressing, take these figures with a grain of salt, try to focus on that bottom stagnating principal funding. That's what we got to be pushing for, because often, unfortunately, donors, I mean, I won't attribute intention to it, whether it's, whether they see it as a box ticking exercise or it's accidental. But I mean, in a way, it speaks well for the future of gender equality that donors see marking projects as gender equality projects as sort of like beneficial to them, that it makes them look good. It's good that, having gender equality as an initiative makes you look good these days, but that's not good enough, right? So I recommend checking out that report. Maybe we can find a link for that, because they talk a bit about sort of analyzing whether these projects are really what they say they are. And unfortunately, the answer is not always.
Yeah, we also have a partner perspective piece written by a colleague at the One campaign, which now we've mentioned a few times, which is, she did a keyword search of projects tagged with these markers. So with keywords like women, girls, sexual and reproductive health and rights, these kinds of things, and then did an analysis of how many of those projects. So in the OECD's data, as some of you probably know, they do have project level data. So you can see like the description of the project in that. And so she did a keyword search of those descriptions and came back with some somewhat frightening results. So do check that out. That's also on our website, and I can share the link for Zoe to send out.
Thank you. We're coming up to the end of the session now. There are just two last questions. So there's a question from Aria who's asking, do you feel recent years' increase in ODA funding supporting gender equality has been materialized in a consistent improvement with gender equality globally? Or do you feel we need not only more resources, but also improvements in how ODA is spent?
Yeah, it's a great question. Kind of similar to what we just spoke about. So, excuse me. So we're not in the business of evaluating effectiveness at the Donor Tracker, but of course we come across, as I mentioned, all types of our colleagues are doing that kind of reporting. So I don't want to make a statement about whether it's better or worse. What I'll say actually is I'm more interested in looking forward and seeing how it's going to look next year. So of course, the data that we have is sort of 2 years behind because it has to be reported and then sorted and organized. So right, it's 2020 and we're reporting on 2018 data. A couple of years from now, I'm really interested to see what 2020 data looks like and 2021. So I would say it's definitely an interesting question, but sort of let's stay focused, looking forward on whether we are going to see the kind of gender responsive COVID recovery that we're pushing for. To me, that's kind of the pressing question in this moment, because every gender advocate everywhere is like really sounding the alarm, like level 10, ding, ding, ding. We need, like, you know, the gender-based violence situation right now is like truly frightening, really, really frightening. And some states, notably like all EU states, actually have now added regulations classifying gender-based violence responses, for example, as like emergency services or frontline services so that they can stay open. But that kind of, you know, that kind of programming isn't happening everywhere in the world, and it needs to be. So I think the answer to your question will become clear kind of in the near future, to see whether donors are learning lessons or whether they're really listening, to gender advocates and experts on this topic who are saying clearly, like, this has to be top of mind.
Great, thanks. And there's just one last question that's come through that's not so much on gender equality, but just asking more generally about Donor Tracker. That you include 7 sectors on Donor Tracker. Would it ever be expanded to include water and sanitation?
Yes, we are always thinking of ways that we can expand. And yeah, we ran recently a survey of our users to ask about what kind of other sectors we should be adding with WASH in there. It's definitely on the list of things we'd like to do. So yeah, always thinking about growing, and we always love to hear what you think. So if WASH is something you'd be interested in knowing more about, please send us an email, and we'll add your vote to the list when we're really thinking about where we're going in 2021 and beyond.
So thank you, both of you. That's really, really interesting. And there were a lot of questions in there. I'm glad we managed to get through them all. One of the things that there were a lot of questions asking if people, if they can have the links to some of the reports that you mentioned and some of the webinars. So we'll get those off you and we'll share them with the recordings and the slides as well that we'll be sharing after this session. So don't worry, you'll be able to get your hands on all the details. Thank you so much for that. It was really thoughtful, interesting, and great to understand where donors are and what we can do to kind of help push them a little bit more so that we can meet some of those challenges that we all set out in SDG 5 and beyond as well. So thank you to the speakers and everybody who asked questions and listened. We're going to be dropping feedback forms into the chat box, so please complete those. It's really helpful for us. They're in there. Freddie's just dropped them now. They just help us work out what worked well and what didn't, so that we can make sure that the sessions just meet your needs a little bit more next time. So thank you very much, everybody, and see you next time. Bye.
Thanks for having us. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.